The rain was relentless, hammering Portland's streets like it held a grudge. In my office, the world felt quieter, but no less heavy. I was a therapist, trained to untangle minds, but nothing prepared me for him, Elliot, the patient who'd unravel me. My name is Dr. Nathan Carter, 35, a man who thought he'd seen every shade of human struggle in his cozy practice on Alberta Street. I'd built a life around listening, nodding, and offering carefully worded insights to people drowning in their own stories. But Elliot Kane, 28, walked in one October evening, and the air shifted, like the city itself held its breath. He was lean, almost too thin, with light brown hair that fell messily over his forehead and eyes that didn't trust the world. His file said he was referred for anxiety, but the way he sat, arms crossed, jaw tight, told me this was more than nerves. "I don't belong here," he said, voice low, like he was daring me to disagree. I didn't. I just waited, because sometimes silence is the only way to start. Elliot's story came in fragments, each one sharper than the last. He grew up in a small Oregon town, the kind where everyone knew your name and judged you for it. His father was a pastor, his mother a ghost in her own home. Being gay wasn't just a sin in their world, it was a betrayal. At 16, Elliot ran away to Portland, chasing freedom, only to find it came with a price: loneliness, odd jobs, and a string of relationships that left him hollow. "I'm not broken," he told me that first session, his voice cracking. "I just don't know how to feel okay." I leaned forward, my pen still. "You don't have to be broken to need help," I said. He looked at me then, really looked, and I felt something stir, something I wasn't supposed to feel. As a therapist, I was trained to keep distance, to be a mirror, not a man. But Elliot's pain was a blade, and it cut through my walls. Over the next few weeks, our sessions became a ritual. Every Thursday at 6 p.m., he'd slump onto my couch, the rain a constant backdrop. He'd talk about the diner where he waited tables, the customers who tipped and insults, the nights he spent staring at his apartment ceiling, wondering if he'd ever be enough. I listened, but I also noticed things I shouldn't have: the way his hands moved when he was nervous, the rare smile that lit up his face like a break in the clouds. I told myself it was empathy, nothing more. I was wrong. One evening, he showed up soaked, his jacket clinging to him like a second skin. "Forgot my umbrella," he muttered, shaking water from his hair. I tossed him a towel from the closet, and when our fingers brushed, the room felt too small. He didn't pull away. Neither did I. That was the first crack in my professionalism, the first moment I knew I was in trouble. "Tell me something about you," he said suddenly, tossing the towel aside. "You're always asking about me. But what's your deal, Doc?" His tone was playful, but his eyes were searching. I hesitated. Therapists don't share. It's rule 1. But the way he looked at me, like he needed to know I was real, made me break it. "I grew up in Seattle," I said, my voice quieter than I meant. "Moved here to start fresh after I realized I wasn't as straight as I thought." It was the first time I'd said it out loud in years. His eyes widened, just for a second, before he nodded, like he'd known all along. That session ran over by 20 minutes. Neither of us cared. By the time he left, the rain had stopped, and I was left staring at my notes, wondering when I'd started writing his name in the margins. The weeks blurred. Elliot's stories grew heavier: abusive exes, a brother who wouldn't speak to him, a life spent running from rejection. But there was light, too. He'd talk about music, how he'd sneak into bars to hear local bands, how a good song could make him feel alive. I started sharing 2 small things, like my love for old jazz records or the time I burned an entire Thanksgiving turkey. He laughed. And God, that sound was dangerous. I knew I was crossing lines. Not physically, not yet, but emotionally. Every session felt less like therapy and more like a conversation between two people who'd forgotten how to be alone. I told myself I could handle it, that I could keep it professional. But every time he walked out, I felt emptier, like he was taking a piece of me with him. One night, he didn't show. No call, no text. I sat in my office, staring at the clock, the rain louder than ever. Panic crept in, irrational but real. Had he relapsed into old habits? Was he hurt? Or had he just decided I wasn't worth his time? I called his number, breaking every ethical rule in the book. No answer. I left a voicemail. My voice too raw. Elliot, it's Nathan. Just, let me know you're okay. He didn't call back. Not that night. Not the next. I told myself it was fine. That patience ghosts sometimes. But it wasn't fine. I was a therapist, but I was also a man, and I was falling for someone I was supposed to fix. 3 days later, Elliot walked back into my office like nothing had happened. His hoodie was damp, his eyes red-rimmed, but he was there, alive, and the relief hit me like a tidal wave. "Miss me, Doc?" he said, smirking, but his voice was brittle, like he was holding himself together with tape. "Where were you?" I asked, too sharp, too personal. He raised an eyebrow, and I caught myself, leaning back in my chair. I was worried. "You didn't call." He shrugged, dropping onto the couch. "Got caught up. Life, you know." But he didn't look at me, and I knew he was lying. I should have pushed, should have done my job, but instead, I let him steer the conversation to safer ground music. The diner. Anything but the truth. I was losing my edge, and he knew it. That session, he talked about his childhood, the parts he'd skipped before. His father's sermons about sin, the way his mother would cry when she thought no one could hear. "I was 14 when I knew I was gay," he said, staring at the floor. "Told my best friend." He told everyone. By the end of the week, I was the town freak. His voice was steady, but his hands shook. I wanted to reach out, to tell him he wasn't that kid anymore, but I stayed silent, gripping my pen like a lifeline. After he left, I sat there, staring at the empty couch. I was supposed to be helping him, but every session felt like he was pulling me into his orbit. I started noticing things outside the office, to his favorite coffee shop, the kind of music he liked playing on my radio. Portland was small, too small, and he was everywhere. The next week, he showed up with a bruise on his cheek. My stomach dropped. "What happened?" I asked, my voice low, trying to keep it professional. He touched the bruise, wincing. "Just a dumb fight at the bar. Some guy didn't like my face." He laughed, but it was hollow. I didn't buy it, but he wouldn't give me more. Instead, he asked about me again, and like an idiot, I answered. I told him about my first love, a guy in college who broke my heart when he left for grad school. Elliot listened, his eyes softening, and for a moment, we weren't therapist and patient. We were just two guys, sharing pieces of ourselves in a city that never stopped raining. I started dreading Thursdays as much as I craved them. Every session was a tightrope walk between duty and desire. I'd catch myself staring at him too long, memorizing the way his lips moved when he talked about something he loved. I'd lie awake at night, replaying our conversations, wondering if he felt it to the pull, the spark, the thing we weren't supposed to name. One evening, he stayed late again. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the office felt too warm, too close. Why do you do this? He asked, out of nowhere. Listen to people's problems all day. Doesn't it get old? I hesitated, then told him the truth. I used to think I could fix people. Now I just want to help them feel less alone. He looked at me, his gaze so intense it burned. You're good at that, he said softly. Making people feel seen. My heart stopped. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. He stood, grabbing his jacket, and for a second, I thought he might lean in, close the gap between us. But he didn't. He just said, "See you next week, Doc," and walked out, leaving me to drown in my own thoughts. I knew I had to stop this. The American Psychological Association's code of ethics was clear: no dual relationships, no blurring lines. I was his therapist, not his friend, not his anything else. But knowing and doing are two different things. And every time I saw him, the rules felt less like laws and more like suggestions. The next session, he was different, quieter, almost fragile. He talked about a guy he'd been seeing, someone new, someone who didn't make me feel like garbage. Jealousy hit me like a punch, and I hated myself for it. I nodded, scribbled notes, played the part, but inside, I was screaming. Sounds like he's good for you, I managed, my voice tight. Elliot tilted his head, studying me. You okay, Doc? You look off. I forced a smile. Just tired, I lied. He didn't push, but the way he looked at me said he didn't believe me either. That night, I went home and poured a glass of whiskey, staring at the city lights from my apartment. I was a therapist, trained to help people navigate their chaos, but I couldn't navigate my own. Elliot was my patient, but he was also the first person in years who made me feel alive. And that was the problem. The line between us was thinning, and I was running out of excuses to pretend it wasn't. Elliot's sessions were no longer just therapy, they were moments I lived for, moments I dreaded ending. Portland's endless gray skies mirrored the fog in my head, and I was losing the battle to stay professional. He started opening up more, peeling back layers I hadn't expected. He told me about his dreams writing songs, maybe even performing someday. I'm not good enough, he said, picking at a loose thread on his jeans. But when I play, it's like I'm not running anymore. I wanted to tell him he was good enough, that he was more than enough, but I swallowed the words. Instead, I asked about his music, and his face lit up, describing chords and lyrics like they were his lifeline. I clung to every word, greedy for more of him. But the bruises kept showing up. A cut on his lip one week, a shadow under his eye the next. He brushed them off, bar fights, clumsy accidents, but I wasn't stupid. Someone was hurting him, and the thought made my blood boil. I pushed, gently at first, then harder. Elliot, you don't have to protect anyone, I said one evening, my voice sharper than I meant. He froze, his eyes darting to the window. It's not like that, he muttered. Just drop it, Nathan. Hearing my name in his voice, not Doc, hit me like a shockwave. I backed off, but the worry gnawed at me. I started breaking more rules. I looked up his address in the client database, not to stalk, but to know he was safe. I drove by his apartment once, a rundown building in Northeast Portland, and hated myself for it. I was spiraling, and I knew it, but I couldn't stop. Every session, every glance, every accidental touch pulled me deeper. One night, he showed up early, catching me off guard. I was still setting up, my desk a mess of papers and coffee cups. He laughed, a real laugh, and said, "You're human after all." I grinned, despite myself. Disappointed. I asked. He shook his head, his eyes locking onto mine. "Nah, I like it." The air crackled, and I knew we were teetering on the edge of something dangerous. That session, he talked about his new boyfriend, Caleb. My stomach twisted, but I listened as he described someone charming, attentive, but with an edge, someone who got jealous sometimes. Warning bells rang in my head, but I couldn't say it outright. Instead, I asked, "Does he make you feel safe?" Elliot hesitated, just for a second, before saying, "Yeah, sure." I didn't believe him, and I hated how much I cared. After he left, I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I was jealous, yes, but more than that, I was scared. Scared for him, scared of what I was becoming. I'd always prided myself on control, on being the steady hand for my patients. But with Elliot, I was anything but steady. The next week, he didn't show again. This time, I didn't call. I told myself it was for the best, that I needed to pull back, to be the therapist he deserved. But 2 days later, I got a text, "Sorry I missed. Can we talk?" My heart leapt, and I hated how much it did. I replied, setting a time, and spent the next 24 hours pacing my apartment, wondering what I'd say. He showed up looking like hell pale, eyes sunken, a fresh bruise on his wrist. "Caleb," he said before I could ask. He didn't mean it. He just gets like that. My jaw clenched so hard it hurt. "Elliot, that's not okay," I said, my voice low but shaking. "You don't deserve that." He looked away, his hands twisting together. "I don't know what I deserve anymore," he whispered. I wanted to cross the room, to hold him, to tell him he deserved everything: love, safety, a life that didn't hurt. But I stayed in my chair, because that's what therapists do. We don't cross lines, even when every fiber of our being screams to. "You deserve to be treated with respect," I said, the words feeling inadequate. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing his face, the way his voice broke, the way he looked at me like I was his only anchor. I was supposed to be helping him heal, but all I could think about was how much I wanted to protect him, not as a therapist, but as a man. And that was the moment I knew I was in too deep. I tried to pull back. I really did. I started scheduling Elliot's appointments earlier, hoping the daylight would keep my feelings in check. I focused on textbook techniques, cognitive behavioral strategies, grounding exercises, anything to keep it clinical. But every time he walked in, my resolve crumbled. His presence was a magnet, and I was powerless against it. He started talking about leaving Caleb. "I know it's bad," he said one afternoon, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not always bad. Sometimes he's good. Like, really good." I nodded, but inside, I was screaming. I'd seen this before: patients trapped in cycles of abuse, clinging to the rare moments of kindness. But with Elliot, it wasn't just professional concern. It was personal, visceral, and it terrified me. I suggested resources, shelters, hotlines, support groups. He listened, but his eyes were distant, like he was already halfway out the door. "I'll think about it," he said, and I knew he wouldn't. I wanted to shake him, to make him see his own worth, but I couldn't. All I could do was sit there, pretending I wasn't falling apart. The next session, he showed up with a guitar. "Thought I'd play you something," he said, almost shy. My heart stopped as he strummed a quiet melody, his voice soft but steady, singing about loss and hope and starting over. It was raw, imperfect, and the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. When he finished, the room was silent except for the ring. "That was for you," he said, not looking at me. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, my throat tight, knowing I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. After that, the sessions changed. They were less about therapy and more about us two people trying to make sense of a connection that didn't fit the rules. He'd bring coffee sometimes, insisting it was just a thank you. But the way he handed me the cup, his fingers lingering, said otherwise. I'd share stories about my life, me dog, my failed attempts at gardening. The way Portland's rain made me feel both trapped and free. He'd laugh, and for those moments, the world felt right. But the bruises didn't stop. One evening, he showed up with a split lip, and I lost it. Elliot, you can't keep doing this, I said, my voice breaking. You're worth more than this. He looked at me, his eyes glassy. You're the only one who thinks that, he said, and it broke something in me. I stood, crossing the room before I could stop myself, and knelt in front of him. You're wrong, I said, my voice low. You're worth everything. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the air thick with everything we weren't saying. Then he leaned forward, and I thought he might kiss me. I wanted him to. God, I wanted it. But he pulled back, standing abruptly. I gotta go, he said, and he was out the door before I could stop him. I sat there for an hour, staring at the empty couch, hating myself. I let it go too far. I was his therapist, not his savior, not his lover. But the truth was, I didn't know how to be just one thing to him anymore. The next week, he canceled. Then the next. I told myself it was for the best. That distance would help me regain control. But I missed his voice, his laugh, the way he made me feel like I was more than a job. I started questioning everything, my career, my ethics, my heart. I'd always thought healing was about fixing people, but Elliot was teaching me it was about connection, about showing up, even when it hurt. When he finally came back, he looked different, stronger. Somehow. I left him, he said. No preamble. Caleb. It's over. Relief flooded me, but it was laced with fear. I'm proud of you, I said, and I meant it. He smiled, a real smile, and for the first time, I saw hope in his eyes. But there was something else, something unspoken, hanging between us like a storm about to break. Elliot's decision to leave Caleb changed everything. He walked into sessions with a new energy, like a weight had been lifted. But I could see the cracks, fear in his eyes when his phone buzzed, the way he flinched at loud noises. Freedom wasn't free, and he was paying the price. He started talking about the future, something he'd never done before. Maybe I'll save up, get out of Portland, he said one evening, his voice bright but shaky. Go somewhere new, start over. I nodded, but the thought of him leaving gutted me. I wanted to tell him to stay, to build a life here, with me. But that wasn't my place. I was his therapist, not his future. Still, the lines kept blurring. He'd linger after sessions, asking about my day, my plans, like he was trying to know me outside the office. I'd answer, because I couldn't help it, because I wanted him to know me, too. One night, he brought a CD, a mix of songs he'd burned for me. Thought you might like these, he said, handing it over with a shy grin. I played it later, alone in my apartment, and every note felt like a piece of him. But the past wasn't done with him. One evening, he showed up late, his face pale, his hands shaking. Caleb's been calling, he said, his voice barely audible. Says he wants to talk. Says he's changed. My heart sank. I knew that script abusers promising redemption, pulling their victims back. You don't owe him anything, I said, sharper than I meant. He nodded, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. I started researching restraining orders, support networks, anything to keep him safe. I told myself it was professional duty, but it was more than that. I cared too much, and it was tearing me apart. Every session, I fought the urge to tell him how I felt, to cross that final line. But I couldn't. Not yet. One rainy afternoon, he showed up with a notebook, pages filled with lyrics. "Can I read you something?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, and he read a poem about a man lost in the rain, searching for a home he'd never had. His voice broke on the last line, and when he looked up, his eyes were wet. "That's about you," he said, so quietly I almost missed it. My heart stopped. I wanted to say something, to tell him he was my home, too, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached for his hand. It was a mistake, a line I couldn't uncross, but in that moment, I didn't care. His fingers closed around mine, warm and trembling, and for a second, the world was just us. Then he pulled away, standing quickly. "I shouldn't have said that," he muttered, grabbing his jacket. "I'll see you next week." He didn't show up the next week, or the week after. I called, texted, left voicemails, but nothing. Panic set in, worse than before. I drove by his apartment again, saw the lights off, the curtains drawn. I told myself he was okay, that he'd just moved on, but the fear was a living thing, clawing at me. Then, one night, my phone rang. It was him. "Nathan," he said, his voice raw. "I need you." He was at a bar downtown, drunk and scared, saying Caleb had found him. I didn't think. I grabbed my keys and drove, the rain blurring my windshield, my heart pounding. When I got there, he was outside, soaked and shivering, his eyes wild. "He was here," he said, clinging to me. He wouldn't leave me alone. I took him to my car, gave him my jacket, and drove him to my place. It was reckless, unethical, everything I wasn't supposed to do. But he was shaking, and I couldn't leave him alone. At my apartment, I made him coffee, wrapped him in a blanket, and sat with him until he stopped trembling. "Thank you," he whispered, his head resting against my shoulder. I didn't say anything. I just held him, because sometimes, that's all you can do. That night changed everything. Elliot slept on my couch, his breathing soft in the dark, and I sat awake, watching him, knowing I'd crossed a line I couldn't come back from. I wasn't just his therapist anymore. I was someone who loved him, and that truth was a weight I couldn't carry alone. The next morning, he was quiet, sipping coffee at my kitchen table. "I'm sorry," he said, not meeting my eyes. "I shouldn't have dragged you into this." I shook my head. "You didn't drag me anywhere. I wanted to help." He looked at me then, his eyes searching, and I knew he felt it too, the thing we'd been dancing around for months. I drove him home, and we didn't talk about it. But the air was different now, charged with something we couldn't ignore. At his next session, he was hesitant, like he was waiting for me to reset the boundaries. I didn't. Instead, I asked, "What do you want, Elliot?" "Not what Caleb wants, or anyone else. You." He stared at me, his breath catching. "I want to be happy," he said finally. "And I want you." My heart stopped. I should have shut it down, referred him to another therapist, ended it right there. But I didn't. I stood, crossed the room, and sat beside him on the couch. "I want you, too," I said, my voice barely a whisper. It was the truth, and it felt like freedom and ruin all at once. We didn't kiss. Not then. But we talked, really talked, about what this meant, what we were risking. He told me he'd been falling for me since that first session, that my voice was the only thing that kept him grounded. I told him I'd been fighting it, trying to be the therapist he needed, but I couldn't anymore. It was messy, unethical, and terrifying, but it was real. The next few weeks were a blur of stolen moments. Coffee outside the office, walks in the rain, quiet nights at my place listening to his music. I referred him to another therapist, citing a conflict of interest, but we both knew what it was. We were falling in love, and neither of us knew how to stop. But Caleb wasn't gone. He kept calling, leaving voicemails that made Elliot's hands shake. One night, I found him outside my apartment, pale and frantic. "He knows," he said. "About us." He saw us together. My stomach dropped. I pulled him inside, locked the door, and called a lawyer friend about a restraining order. But the fear in Elliot's eyes was a reminder. Love wasn't enough to keep him safe. We started being careful, meeting in secret, avoiding places Caleb might show up. But Portland was small, and Caleb was persistent. One evening, I got a call from the hospital. Elliot had been attacked, beaten badly enough to need stitches. I rushed there, my heart in my throat, and found him in a sterile room, his face bruised but his eyes still fierce. "I'm okay," he said, gripping my hand. "I'm not letting him win." I stayed with him that night, holding his hand, promising I wouldn't let go. But inside, I was breaking. I was supposed to protect him, to help him heal, but all I'd done was pull him into my world, where he wasn't safe. I started questioning everything, my feelings, my choices, my right to love him. When he was released, I took him to my place, ignoring the voice in my head screaming about ethics. He needed me, and I needed him. We kissed for the first time that night, under the dim glow of my living room lamp, and it was everything soft, desperate, a promise we didn't know how to keep. The restraining order didn't stop Caleb. He was a shadow, always lurking, leaving notes on Elliot's car, calling from blocked numbers. We lived on edge, jumping at every sound, but we clung to each other, building something fragile and beautiful in the chaos. Elliot moved in with me, unofficially at first, then permanently. His guitar sat in my living room, his clothes mixed with mine. We'd cook dinner together, laugh over bad TV, and for the first time, I saw him happy, not just surviving, but living. But the fear was always there, a weight we couldn't shake. I started seeing a therapist myself, trying to make sense of what I'd done. I'd broken every rule, risked my license, my career, for love. My therapist was kind but blunt. "You can't save him, Nathan. You can only love him." I knew she was right, but loving him felt like the only thing I was good at anymore. One night, Elliot played me a new song, one he'd written about us. It was raw, haunting, about two people finding light in the dark. When he finished, he looked at me, his eyes shining. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he said. I pulled him close, kissing him, feeling like I'd finally found my place in the world. But Caleb wasn't done. One evening, we came home to find my apartment trashed, books torn, furniture overturned, a note scrawled on the wall, "You can't have him." Elliot froze, his breath ragged, and I held him, promising we'd get through this. I called the police, filed reports, but Caleb was a ghost, always one step ahead. We decided to leave Portland. It wasn't running. Not exactly. It was choosing a life where we could breathe. We picked a small town in Washington, far enough to start over, but close enough to feel familiar. I'd give up my practice, start fresh, maybe teach or write. Elliot wanted to focus on his music, maybe even record an album. It was a dream, fragile but ours. The night before we left, Caleb found us. He was waiting outside my apartment, eyes wild, a knife in his hand. "You think you can take him?" he shouted, lunging at me. Elliot pushed me out of the way, taking the Haida shallow cut to his arm. I tackled Caleb, pinning him until the police arrived, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Elliot was okay, physically, but the fear lingered, a reminder of how close we'd come to losing everything. As we sat in the hospital, his hand in mine, I realized something. Healing wasn't about fixing the past. It was about building a future, together, no matter how messy it got. We left Portland the next week, driving north under a sky finally free of rain. The town we chose was quiet, nestled between mountains and sea, a place where we could be us without looking over our shoulders. I rented a small house with a porch, and Elliot set up his guitar in the living room, filling the space with music. I didn't practice therapy anymore. I couldn't, not after everything. Instead, I started writing a book about love, loss, and the messy beauty of human connection. Elliot read every page, his notes in the margins, his voice in my head. He started performing at local cafes, his songs drawing crowds who saw what I saw, a man who'd been through hell and come out stronger. Caleb was gone, locked away after the attack, but his shadow lingered in Elliot's quiet moments. The times he'd stare out the window, lost in thought. I'd hold him then, reminding him he was safe, that we were safe. Healing wasn't linear, it was a dance. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But we danced it together. One evening, as the sun set over the water, Elliot took my hand and led me to the porch. I wrote something for you, he said, picking up his guitar. The song was soft, a love letter in chords, about a man who thought he knew healing until someone showed him what it really meant. When he finished, I was crying, and so was he. I love you, he said, and I said it back, the words feeling like a vow. We weren't perfect. I still wrestled with guilt over breaking the rules, over the life I'd left behind. Elliot still carried scars, inside and out. But we were together, and that was enough. Healing, I learned, wasn't about erasing pain. It was about finding someone who made the pain worth carrying, someone who made you want to keep going. As we stood on that porch, the stars bright above us, I realized Elliot hadn't just been my patient. He'd been my teacher, showing me that love real, messy, complicated love was the truest form of healing. And in that moment, with his hand in mine, I knew we'd be okay.